welcome to, thank you, Claire. Welcome to this month's Community-Led Housing Network meeting. These are monthly meetings facilitated by the Wales Cooperative Centre, and each month has a different theme. So today we're looking at exploring how housing associations can partner with community-led housing. So just to introduce myself quickly, I'm Nicola. I work for the Development Trust Association Wales. The DTA are a partner on the Communities Creating Homes programme, and we deliver the Explore phase, which is the early stage support, and we use a network of mentors to support groups. So as I mentioned, we're working in partnership with the Wales Cooperative Centre, and the project is funded by the Nationwide Foundation and Welsh Government, and it runs until March 2022. So there's a number of colleagues from the Wales Cooperative Centre on the call today, including Claire, who will be supporting me with the Zoom facilitation. I'd also like to introduce you to Hugh Russell. He has started in the last month with the Wales Cooperative Centre and works alongside David Palmer as the Communities Creating Homes Programme Manager. So if I just hand over to Hugh very quickly, just to introduce himself.
Cheers, Nicola. Hi, everybody. Yeah, just joined up with the team at the Wales Co-op Centre. I think this is week 4. It's been a brilliant start so far. Everybody's been very welcoming, and it's great to start meeting some folk out in the community, working on community-led housing or thinking about it. My background is in homelessness prevention and in housing policy. I worked for Community Housing Cymru for a few years on the policy team, which is a really good experience, and it's given me a useful insight into how RSLs work, which will hopefully be of some value in this conversation today. Oh, hello. Yeah, most recently I've been working on a campaign to end homelessness amongst young people in Wales, which again, there's some crossover here. With that campaign, we started got the wheels in motion on developing a Welsh version of a Finnish model, a youth housing association. So we're looking to build in some cooperative elements to that. I'm still involved in that. But that's enough about me. Should we crack on?
Thanks very much, Hugh.
Cheers, Nicola.
Okay, so as I mentioned, today's session is focusing on exploring how housing associations can partner with community-led housing. Last month's meeting, we were lucky to have Judy James, Minister for Climate Change, attend, and she spent some time to acknowledge and fully support the role that community-led housing can play in supporting the Welsh Government to deliver their ambitious target of 20,000 new low-carbon homes for rent within the social sector within this government term. She emphasised that truly sustainable communities are those with mixed tenure, so those sort of owner-occupied, social rent and shared accommodation available together in a space that satisfies people's needs. I mean, this statement can be interpreted to highlight how community-led housing groups have a real opportunity to develop meaningful and mutual partnerships with housing associations. Within Explore, and the phase within Communities Creating Homes that I deliver, many of the groups that I work with have a great deal of apprehension around the concept of forming these partnerships. I hope that today's meeting will highlight some of the opportunities and some of the challenges, and hopefully encourage some groups to at least explore these opportunities. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our host for today's session, Keith Edwards. Keith has over 30 years experience in housing and community engagement as a former director of both CIH Cymru and TPAS Cymru. Between 2007 and 2010, he was seconded into Welsh Government to set up and run the Eye2Eye project to support social landlords and involve tenants in the process of achieving the Welsh Housing Quality Standard. He's a strong and long-standing commitment to community and cooperative housing, having worked with a number of co-ops and mutuals, which I'm sure he'll describe in a little more detail today. Keith works as a full-time consultant and supports the Communities Creating Homes programme, both as a mentor on the Explore stage and also as a business consultant with the Wales Cooperative Centre. So over to Keith. Are you muted, Keith?
I was muted. You're right. Thanks, Nick. I was wondering whether it was a conspiracy, but I actually did it myself, so I can't blame anybody else. You know, this is a really interesting time to be involved in community-led housing. I think coming on the back of what Julie James said last time, I think it's particularly apt that we're going into a more practically focused discussion today based on perhaps a little bit of reflective stuff around how we've got to where we are, which I'll sort of say a little bit about in a few minutes. But I think the really interesting stuff is going to be the second session, which is essentially Mike and then Lisa and Simone talking about some of their practical experiences. Mike coming from the perspective of somebody who's been a cooperator, it's almost in his bones, you know, he's been doing it for so long. And also has a lot of current experience in a Welsh context of putting mutual principles into practice and community-led housing at the core of that. And then Lisa and Simone, who are very much committed partnership working in Rhondda, and perhaps at the early stages of a journey in terms of community-led housing. But there's lots of lessons, I think, in how we build relationships, and we'll hear from Lisa and Simone at that point. Then we're going to hand over to the third part, which is everybody having a chance really to get their views out there, because the whole point about this network is to get people stimulating conversation going, getting innovative ideas out there, and also asking the difficult questions, because what we don't want is to see this as some kind of PR job for community-led housing. It is really about getting into some of the practicalities, learning, and then going forward on the back of that. So that's the sort of shape of the session. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes just going through a little bit of the context. And there's sort of three parts to this. One is just to give you a little bit about the backstory from my perspective. As Nick said, 30 years, a number of you weren't born when I started getting involved in this agenda. So, it's been a long sort of journey, but one that I've been fascinated with. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a backstory in terms of the relationships between housing associations and communities, if you like. I then want to just flag up a piece of work that Dave Palmer commissioned a few years ago that myself and Joy, my wife, did on looking at the early experience of some of the co-ops that the Co-op Housing Project, as it was then called, had actually set up, and some of the lessons, not least because I think there's some really good lessons for current thinking really about this space. And then thirdly, I want to flag up a guide that's been endorsed by the National Housing Federation and HACT on how housing associations and community-led housing can work together, share with you a little bit about some of the advantages of working in that space, but also flag up that the guide itself has got some really useful stuff in terms of the different types of organizations that have been developed, different ways of working that have been developed, and also there's quite a few case studies that I think people would find useful as well. So that's the sort of contextual stuff. So if it's okay with you, I'll just move on to the first part of the 3 points I wanted to cover. And this is really about the backstory. And when I was thinking about this, we talk about community-led housing and housing associations as though they're sort of, I don't know, apples and pears really. But of course, if you go back far enough, essentially housing associations, many of them were community-led housing initiatives. I've just recently stood down from TAF's board, and my wife is chair of Cynon TAF. And both those organisations, I would say, not only can root themselves back to being community activist initiatives in the sort of 60s and 70s and 80s, but actually still carry a lot of that in their DNA in terms of how they look at things and what they want to achieve. So my sort of thought was really that in a way, the sector and the housing sector and community-led housing are like strange siblings. Perhaps they've grown apart, perhaps they're not quite as close as they used to be, but they share a sort of common ancestry, common DNA, maybe. Of course, things changed quite dramatically in 1979 with the election of the Conservative government, where things like the right to buy and essentially the stop put on councils building meant that housing associations' role fundamentally changed. And in the Housing Act, and Mike will know a lot about this, in the Housing Act in 1988, for example, it was almost signed and sealed that housing associations would be the main providers of new social housing, and that they would be involved in things like stock transfer. The importance of that is that I think there was a bit of a challenge then to keeping states true to the values of the original community-led housing associations. If you look at Wales today, you know, I did a bit of work on this some time ago. I'd say housing associations fall into three broad categories. You know, there's a bit of mix and match here. There's a bit of blur in between the lines. But if you think of it, the 30 or so developing housing associations, I would say, fall into these three categories. There are those that are still very community focused. Mike will tell you he chairs Cardiff Community Housing Association. So there's ones that are very geographically specific. And I would argue that they are the ones, by and large, who've tended to be closer to this community-led housing ethos, if you like, that we're going to explore today. RHA I would say are another good example of, you know, very clear about their roots, maybe looking at, you know, moving forward in different ways, but very clear about where they came from and the communities that they work with. And Simone will tell you, I'm sure, a bit about that later. Then you've got the transfers and mutuals. Interesting, I think, here is the story. 11 of the 22 local authorities transferred their homes to new landlords. Just under half of them are mutual organisations, but the ones that aren't mutuals behave in many ways like mutuals, with very, very strong links to residents. I'm not saying this is universally a great picture, but there's definitely something that happened in the sector going back 10 years ago when transfers started happening that sort of reinvigorated this sort of community focus. And of course, all the transfers are at the moment, at least, you know, limited by the sort of geographical boundaries of the local authority. One or two looking at initiatives in other areas, to be fair. But by and large, they still define themselves as being part of a particular local authority area. And then the third type are what I've called the regional nationals. These are bigger organisations by and large. They're traditional housing associations that might have started in a particular community, but have expanded. And I know, you know, in some instances in 9, 10, 11 plus local authority areas. People like United Welsh, Wales and West, you know, fall into that category. Pobl is another one. But they're sort of distinct types of housing associations, if you like. So one of the points that struck me is that there's been a certain amount of mission drift. You know, if you think of the organisations that are true to those initial social purposes, they always had to be viable businesses. So they were proudly, they saw themselves and expressed themselves as being social businesses. But I think there's a sense, and again, one or two people who come after me in this discussion might want to reflect on this, where the social side of things perhaps has gone into the background, and the sort of commercial side of things has maybe come to the fore. You could argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I would just say it's a fact that this has happened over the last 15, 20 years in particular, particularly since housing associations became the main provider of new social housing. It's an interesting dynamic, though, and one I think that we have to take into account when we're talking about building relationships between community groups and housing associations themselves. And of course, the other bit of the backstory is the project that Dave was the original project worker with, and Casey and Claire, you know, are now working with, and Hugh's joined the team, you know, and that's actually made a difference, I think, initially in just raising awareness of what could happen in this space. And of course, the work that Nick is running with DTA, the mentoring scheme, has a role in that. And I'm glad, I think Michelle from Kyra is on the call, and hopefully we can tap into some of Michelle's experiences, because they've been going through this process as well. I think that you can't underestimate the importance of having a dedicated resource in this space, because the opportunity to develop further is immense, in my opinion. So the second one I just wanted to flag up is this report that Dave commissioned, that we did a few years ago. Essentially, it was looking at the co-op experience to date. We looked at the 4 pioneers, as we called them at the time, housing association, CLH projects that have been developed. And essentially what we found was a number of lessons. So for the co-op schemes themselves, and this was specifically around a co-op model, we're obviously not talking necessarily about co-op or mutual model here, but this was the remit of the report, if you like. First off, that each one of them, housing associations had in effect been incubators. They'd actually taken on a lot of responsibility for making sure that the initiatives got off the ground in the first place, and did a lot of effort in making sure that the group that was helped to set up was actually supported, not just in the short term. They fall into three categories. There were new build schemes where the opportunity was seen to establish a co-op or part of the schemes being cooperatively run. There were remodeling existing home schemes where, and Mike will tell you about Tafechan in particular, in Merthyr Valley Home, so I won't steal his thunder on that. But areas where something was needed to sort of stimulate what was going on in that particular community, and co-ops was an area that was explored. And then there were area regeneration co-ops, and the one that we looked at in particular was West Rill Community Land Trust, where they took over responsibility for a number of properties incrementally and built up a portfolio of properties, if you like. And probably that's something that, you know, Lisa and Michelle in particular, that's the sort of model that probably more closely links with some of the things that they're exploring at the minute. What we found from cooperators was that they all said that the housing experience that they gained from coming into a co-op was much better than their previous experience. A lot of them had come from the private rented sector, for example, and they really felt that their standards and their opportunities improved immensely on the basis of getting involved. Let's be clear about it. And, you know, Dave and others have got scars on their back on this one, including me. Maintaining the active interest of members was a constant challenge, and is a constant challenge, and these things fluctuate. We found that actually getting people together socially helped immensely in terms of building those sort of common bonds. And there was another word of warning that community-led housing is a benign, good thing to do. But, you know, you have to have one eye on it not becoming too exclusive as well, in my view. It needs to be, you know, open and accountable, and looking at, you know, ways of making sure that it's not becoming a clique, if you like. And I'm not saying that necessarily means it has to constitute itself as a mutual or a co-op, but it has to, I think, you know, community-led housing has to reflect back on its relationship with the wider community. Sort of secrets in the name, really. The lessons for housing associations, a number of people from housing associations on the call, and local authorities, was that there's a danger in things being too top down, not least because when you start to withdraw, you know, you're not altogether sure that the foundations are firm enough underneath. So that was one of the lessons of the report. But ironically as well, you also needed that high level support and buy-in, you know, classically from a chief exec. And again, not stealing Mike's thunder, but, you know, that was the sort of Tafechan approach, really. You definitely need individual champions within organizations. You need champions with clout, I think, more accurately. You need champions who can, you know, have the energy and enthusiasm, but also have the connectivity within their organizations to get things moving, to get things done when, you know, parts of the organization might not be aware or not able to sort of react to working differently in relation to mutual housing and community-led initiatives. And also, if you look at any model, and this is something, again, is, you know, you have to say this every time, really, that this is not a fobbing people off into something that's cuddly or what have you. They have to be, initiatives have to be sustainable and financially viable in the long term. It's great to hear Hugh talking actually about the continuity with his last job in terms of youth homelessness, because I think that's exactly the sort of model that, you know, I'm sure could be built sustainably and actually could have legs in terms of being around for a long time, you know, precisely because you've got energy, enthusiasm, but you're going to have to look at the sort of model you build as well to make sure it's financially viable. Final point before I hand over to the practitioners is to just flag up this practical guide to partnerships. I think Nick is going to drop the links to both documents in the chat. Have a look at this one. It only came out in December last year. 3 parts to it, really. The pros and cons stuff, which I'll just briefly mention, of working together. And then, as I said, there's quite a lot of different models sort of outlines, which might be interesting to look at depending on where you are in the process. And then a number of case studies, which I think always, say a lot more than any sort of guidance, in my opinion. 2 slides to share with you. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but they come early on in the report, and they essentially flag up why housing associations should work with community-led housing initiatives, and then vice versa. And you'll see it all there. It's around expertise, it's around solid businesses, it's about management experience, that they're registered so they know how to do things properly, that they have existing relationships with people that community-led housing initiatives will have to maybe get relationships with. And they can also train and capacity build, and they can also skill share. And in my experience, I found housing associations to be very generous in that space. They don't see you as competitors. They're more than happy, and it's part of their values to work with community groups. And again, I know Simone is going to mention that in relation to RHA. And then as far as the groups actually partnering with housing associations, actually, sometimes you can't meet everything you want to through your mainstream activities. CLH groups can also access grant funding that can actually help to support delivering on housing need in particular communities as well. And you'll see there's a lot of other things in there around the advantages that CLHs can bring to working with housing associations. I'll leave you obviously reflect on some of those rather than go through them in any detail. So that essentially is all I wanted to say. Sort of brings us neatly on time. I mean, I don't know, Nick, if you want to take any questions at this point, or whether we go into the next session and then see what time we've got left. What do you think?
I think move straight on at this point, but if anybody has any reflection questions at this point, if you want to pop them in the chat so you don't forget them, and then we can pick them up at the end just before we go into the breakout rooms.
So I'm going to ask Mike first. I'm not going to, Mike, ex-chief exec Merthyr Valley Homes, he'll tell you all about his experience. And I've asked him to reflect on some of the lessons for people interested in this sort of area, really, before we ask our second group. So Mike's got about 15 minutes. I'll give him a gentle nod. I don't think he will, but I'll give him a gentle nod if he's got a couple of minutes remaining, and then we'll go into our second practitioner session.
Thanks, Keith. Hello, everyone. Nice to have the opportunity to speak to you. I'm not in Wales. I'm in Cornwall at the moment, and it's rather warm. But as Keith said, I've actually got an even longer history than Keith. We sound like these 2 old timers who sit at the side of the Muppets, just moaning from the balcony about how housing used to be great in our day, but it actually never was. And I started work on housing co-ops in Birmingham in 1987, and I went to a housing conference a few years ago and bumped into a whole load of people who were still running the co-ops I helped set up in Walsall, which was just such a lovely feeling to meet people nearly 40 years later, still hugging and having a laugh and talking about the time the Housing Corporation nearly didn't fund us, and just remembering the history of their organisation and the small part I played in it. It was just really nice to know that some things have values that have longevity, and that's one of the reasons I've always particularly liked co-ops. So I also was the chief exec of Merthyr Valley Homes, which I don't know if people know, became Wales's largest tenant and employee mutual. So both the tenants and the employees had shares in the mutual and could appoint the board of directors and the chief exec. And I remember one of my fellow chief execs saying to me, "My God, Mike, why would you do that? They could fire you." And I said, well, quite frankly, if they wanted to fire me, it shouldn't be an organization I'm running. If I haven't got the dressing room to run it as the chief exec, why would I want to be there? And I shouldn't be there. So I had no worries about that level of democracy. But as part of that regeneration, the reinvigoration, the issues in Merthyr around disconnected communities, we also had a look at an issue in a place, some of you will know Gelli Deg in Merthyr, with the fantastic Gelli Deg Association, who do amazing community work up there. And there was a block of flats which the Gelli Deg Foundation had been in, and next to it was 2 other ones that were just boarded up. They'd been empty since 1996. Not that there wasn't a housing need in Merthyr, there just wasn't a housing need for shitty old red brick flats with dusty, horrible corridors that were just terrible. And that community didn't want a lot more single people moving in, because it kind of had enough flats there, it had enough issues. And we had a long think about, the obvious solution would have just been to knock it down and build a few houses. But we decided that perhaps a co-op would be a solution. And we went into setting up Tafec and Housing Co, which wasn't easy to do, in the sense, Welsh government kind of weren't prepared for co-ops. They weren't thinking about it. They weren't working out how it was going to be regulated, how it's going to be funded, who would fund it. But luckily, Hugh Lewis was the Minister for Housing at the time, was also the AM for Merthyr, and was both the Labour Party and Co-op Party member. And Hugh was super supportive. And so we kind of had this golden feeling that whatever we said to civil servants, there would be a yes, or Hugh would go and change it. So we kind of knew that we were pushing on an open door. And there was a couple of minor hitches, but broadly it went through. But it went through on a couple of really good technical issues, because you get this dichotomy in community housing and co-op housing in particular, of who owns the debt. So if you borrow money to do the houses up or build new houses, so say you were going to build 20 houses and you needed 1.5 million pounds, well, you might hope Welsh Government would give you some of that money, perhaps 600, 800,000, but you've actually got to borrow the remainder from a bank. Well, if you're a community organisation with a constitution that's pretty loose and flexible, you've kind of been together running something. As most of you who run businesses would know, the banks aren't particularly, the funders are awash with cash. They're absolutely awash with cash, but that doesn't mean they want to lend it to people they don't know. And a friend of mine's a fund manager at Savills, and he just says people just come to Savills every single day with billions of pounds wanting to invest in social housing and rented housing in Great Britain because it's so profitable. He said, but equally, that doesn't mean they'd on-lend to a cooperative or a mutual, particularly one that's in a deprived area where the value of the houses is less than the debt you're going to build. So you build them and they're not worth as much as the opening price, particularly if they've got tenants in. So it wasn't an easy one. That's a real difficult dilemma. And that's why you get this, partnering with a housing association means that they can take the debt. But the downside of partnering with the housing association is they borrow the money, but then they have to have a control mechanism to make sure that money's safe. And then the co-op might want to act independently, might want to make decisions against the housing association, but all they'll be thinking about is that organisation owes 800,000 quid. We've got to protect our money because it's public money. And you kind of get these complex control and lack of control structures. And we were incredibly lucky because Merthyr Council on-lent to Merthyr Valley Homes they've got a facility. They didn't even know they had the capacity to do it. And I persuaded them that other councils have on-lent in England and they had the powers were the same. And they on-lent just under £500,000 to Merthyr Valley Homes. And we did the flats up and had an agreement, a lease basically. So the co-op leased the shell of the building, which protected that repayment to Merthyr. And they paid for that lease, which meant the co-op could be both fully mutual and make some of its own decisions without being a kind of tenant organisation or community organisation within that framework. And it then meant that they the critical bit was who controls who in a relationship with the housing association. Because, with the best will in the world, you'll have lovely people like me, or lovely people from the community against full-time housing professionals, and it's an imbalance in skills and experience to get a good agreement between the two. And you don't want to spend thousands of pounds on solicitors' fees between the two parties, and model management agreements are really around there, are out and about, and they're still good, but it's the power relationship between two bodies and how you manage that as a housing association and as a community organisation. So for the community organisations, and speaking to you as community people, I would say, get the housing association to do it for the right reasons, the right values, work with the right partners in a positive way. And for the housing associations, what better lesson than you could learn about your own services than an articulate, coordinated group of tenants telling you your repair service is rubbish, or telling you your housing management services needs improving, or your fire safety isn't up to scratch. It's just a fantastic opportunity to have fully involved people who are skilled, committed, training, working with you, challenging your assumptions that you're brilliant, that just because you put you're brilliant in your annual report. So it has good positive reasons for a housing association to do it, as well as long-term community reasons in changing values in all areas and doing good stuff in the long term. And the other thing that Keith raised, which is probably just worth covering, is how you deal with the cooperative not becoming exclusive, excluding certain members of the community, having policies that are inherently racist or homophobic or whatever it might be, and without having the housing association all over it night and day, checking every allocation, checking every letting, making sure everything's done fairly. And the way we decided to approach this at Merthyr was to use the co-op principles, which Keith and Casey and Hugh and others will have volumes of copies of, around about how the co-op principles work. And part of the lease agreement was the co-op had to follow the co-op principles in how it operated. And if they didn't follow the co-op principles, we could end the management agreement. So that was the control mechanism. It was more like a step in if things weren't done, rather than a continual monitoring process. But equally, ending a co-op is an awful thing, because the people still live in those houses. And we kind of had an agreement with the council that if the co-op folded because they just got bored, they didn't want to do it anymore, they'd all become tenants of Merthyr Valley Homes. They wouldn't be made homeless as a result of the co-op deciding it didn't want to be in existence. And that was something we planned in at the beginning. It's been, last time I heard, I don't like to jump in and check how things are going when you've done something in the past, because it kind of feels like you don't trust anyone else to keep it running. But last I heard is it was great, and the people were really happy. And it's, it has all the usual problems. Somebody doesn't do the cleaning, somebody doesn't do the grass cutting, just the things you'd expect, intentions. But generally, the houses are in huge demand. And considering 10 years ago, you couldn't have given one away for rent-free. There's a waiting list. People are keen to live there. A few staff from Merthyr Valley Homes who moved to the area applied, and a couple of them live there. It's just a really nice community of people who don't want to be owners and would struggle to get into the rented market. Wasn't working for them. So it's just been a really successful project, regenerating a small bit of Merthyr. The ones in other places like Walsall have just been absolutely fantastic and have changed the centre of Walsall hugely, how they've done that. So there's lots of brilliant examples of people changing and doing stuff. And I think the thing I would go back for, the message is, it's the power relationship between a professional housing association and good, honest community people, and how you manage that. And you'll have experienced it in other parts of community businesses, trying to get loans from banks, trying to work with Welsh Government departments. And it's getting that balance right with a housing association partner right from the get-go. And as Keith says, getting people in the right positions in an organisation to buy in, and not allocating it to a temporary post on 20,000 who's on a 6-month contract, and then you keep getting different members of staff. Oh, we're really committed to this co-op, but we're so committed to it, we're not actually going to put anyone full-time on it at a senior grade, and insist that if there is someone working on it, that one of the directors or one of the board members is also involved, and it's not just left to a kind of junior enthusiastic project officer, because what will invariably happen is they'll get another job if they're good, and then you'll have to start building a new relationship with another one. Get somebody from the senior team to be part of it. Anyway, I kind of reached my allotted time, I think. Have I, Keith?
That's great, Mike. And I know people will want to ask questions. Actually, we have got a few minutes. I will just ask if anybody wants to ask anything of Mike in the couple of minutes we've got. If anybody wants to, I can't actually see if people have put their hands up. So if people want to jump in. If not, we'll move on. But does anybody want to ask Mike a question specifically?
Could I just add one thought before people ask something? Was as part of the co-op party, I wrote a response to the review of Welsh housing. And one of the suggestions I had was that all housing schemes over 25 units in Wales should have, as part of the development package, they should have an either community ownership, community management, or an active community development process as part of the new build. I think we're in danger in Wales of building some fairly big sites, 30, 40, 100 unit sites, and not building in from the outset a level of community involvement in those schemes. But there's such an aspiration to build 20,000 new houses. We kind of might miss the boat on how that housing is going to be run long term.
No, cheers, Mike. It's a really, really good point. I think what I'll do, if people are okay, is anybody, might jump in to get in. It's, your chance to do that now. But if nobody wants to, I'll move on. Does anybody want to ask Mike a question or make a comment at this point? Shall I?
Mind, Keith, if that's all
right.
Yeah,
go on. You carry on, Hugh. Carry on.
Mike, you mentioned the 20,000 homes for social rent target. Yeah. That's written into the programme for government. We've also got a commitment from government to community-led housing, which is wicked to see. We're delighted with that. I guess I just wondered about what your thoughts are on, as a former chief exec of a housing association, how would you respond to that? Would you be thinking, God, there's a lot of pressure there, we've got to start building like crazy, and we'll let community-led stuff sit to one side. This is all about getting units out as quick as we can. I'm not sure what sort of buttons we need to be pressing as the co-op centre to move things along in terms of the partnerships with housing associations. So I guess I just value your insight on that.
I think it's kind of, as you say, there is just this pressure to build, and why we kind of we've thought through a little bit about not building junk housing with bad. We want high standards, we want eco, we want energy, we want the right community. I don't think the final bit of how these housing projects are managed post-completion has really been thought through in terms of communities and community development. And the lessons are there for us. It's screaming. You only have to go to, the pressure to build in the 60s, massive housing estates on hills throughout Wales. They were built, they were beautiful when they started. People were happy to move from terraces that needed knocking down. But within 10 years, all the underlying problems had manifested themselves and people didn't want to live in them. And we kind of can't go back down that again. And why we think, we've learned the lesson of we'll never build system built again. But we might build system built with timber frame. We kind of don't know. And we're not building a mechanism in for residents, communities. And I think, 25 was kind of an arbitrary number, but it felt an estate of more than 25 felt like you needed some community activity, some community buy-in to a project of more than 25. And yet there's no criteria for that at all of how you do it. And I think, you know, maybe if the scheme was 100, that at least a percentage of it should be cooperative housing or distinctly community-led, as a way of breaking up the monolithic management that could end up being there. The other thing that most people kind of don't really think about, sorry I'm bossing the questions and answers here, but is when you build a housing estate of 30 houses for people in need, you don't build a mature scheme. So if you go on a normal housing estate, there'll be people with kids who've grown up and people with little kids and elderly people and a mix, and kind of the minister really likes this idea of a mixed community. And I think it's not just mixed in terms of incomes, the doctor and the labourer living next door to each other, you know, the kind of mythical Wales, but it's also, you build 25 3-bed houses, you're effectively putting 65 kids of school age into that street, which is an incredible management issue to deal with. And that is, you know, you go around some of them in England, they're just, everyone calls them the ghetto when they're there, and it takes like 15 years to mature the estate. And basically what they mean by mature is those kids have moved out. So you get the loads of kids, and then when they're all teenagers, just like my kids, loads of cars everywhere. And then you kind of get this mature, oh, everyone likes living there. But actually, you know, you've got to build in some community mechanisms for dealing with that, the change that occurs in those people's lives. And some of the co-op schemes in Wales have been great at doing that, you know, bringing people in before the allocations, talking to each other, setting up ideas for how they're going to live and work together as a community on an estate. And we just kind of go, oh no, you're next on the list, you're next, you're next, you're next. Here's your keys, let's hope it all works. I've got another project to build down the road. And we've got to learn, you know, that's just, you know, it's just enthusiasm to meet a target at the expense of, you know, the consequences of bad housing management and the lack of community involvement. Sorry, guys, I just
that's
went off on one, didn't I?
Right on. That's really good, and really good points to draw out. And we'll have a chance to explore some of those further in the groups. So I'm gonna move on now to the sort of next part of this session. Lisa from Arts Factory and Simone from RHA, formerly Rhondda Housing Association, essentially to explore some issues around partnership working. So I'm going to kick off with Lisa. I was going to ask you, Lisa, just to say, introduce yourself really, and tell us, you know, what Arts Factory is about really, you know, what it does, why it does what it does. And I'll ask Simone to say the same about RHA, and then we perhaps explore the sort of community work together, sort of, and explore housing opportunities as well later. So Lisa, over to you first.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Lisa Wills, Chief Executive of Arts Factory. We're in our 30th year, well, our 30th year was last year, which got totally disrupted by COVID, but we're in our 30th year, and we exist really to change people's lives, and that's it in a nutshell. We work with people who are different, who don't always fit into the norm in society. We work with a lot of people with learning disabilities, mental health issues, and they come to us to improve their lives. Quite often it's a boomerang service. People build themselves up, go off and do great things, and they hit a crisis in their life, and quite often they come back to us. So yeah, we've offered this service in Ferndale for a very long time now, and obviously well known within the community. As an organisation, obviously, and a registered charity, we're looking to look at other income streams going forward, and also the ethos of us as an organisation. We have a lot of people who struggle with housing, either poor private housing, or we've got a lot of people who are in sheltered accommodation housing, who are quite able and are now looking to sort of move with less support around them. So we've moved one person with a learning disability into private rented property at the moment, but housing is always, I would say, it's an issue for, not, you know, we work with around 50 volunteers every week, and I would say housing can be an issue for probably maybe 10 of those people. So it's not huge numbers for us. So, you know, it's how we can move to another area of work that fits with our ethos. And what we're about as an organisation is changing people's lives for the better. And I think this is where, you know, working with Nicola and with Keith, and obviously Rhondda Housing, I still can't get used to calling them RHA. Yeah, it's just a new venture for us that fits with our ethos of improving lives, really. So I think that's us in a nutshell, Keith, I think.
That's spot on, Lisa. Thank you. And I'm going to ask Simone to say similar now, because, you know, this is a partnership in all senses. So there's two partners involved here. So do you want to say things from your perspective, Simone?
Yeah, fine. So I'll tell you just a little bit about RHA first. And it's really funny because when we were on the housing, people used to call us RHA because it was easier. And now we are RHA. Anyway, yeah, so for those of you who maybe are not too familiar with RHA, we were established just over 40 years ago. 3 small houses in Tylerstown, terraced houses, which is not far from where Lisa's based. And I think, like Keith was saying, you know, the history and the culture of an organisation, it was established due to the poor kind of levels of housing that were available then. So we started with 3 small properties. We now have 1,800 homes across RCT, and you know, our tenants are very keen on calling them homes. We have some staff that still use the phrase units, and I know it's just they don't mean anything by it. It's just technical speak and linked to their roles, but you know, they are homes, and we work really hard to try and identify them as that. So we have 1,800 homes across RCT, 70 staff. So we are fairly small when you think of some of the other housing associations. Even in RCT, you know, we are one of the smallest. But just thinking of our commitment to working in partnership. So I head up the community and enterprise team. My kind of work history since I was 19 has always been community work, youth work, supported housing for young people, that kind of thing. So I've brought that background into RHA with me. And I can be a real challenge sometimes because I'm definitely more a community person than a housing person. So I think that's really important to bring that balance. But in terms of RHA, one element of our corporate plan, which I'm really pleased with, and it is corporate, but you know, we delivered it kind of in a community way. One element of our corporate plan says that we will take every opportunity to work collaboratively to maximise our social impact. Now that is very corporate, that language, you know, but ultimately what it means for me is that I have got permission to go out and work in partnership and take every opportunity to just work with people like Lisa in the community who are doing really good work and who are established and rooted where they are. So yeah, our approach to partnership work is always to look for trusted and established organisations in the community and do what we can to support them. Because we recognise the expertise, like people like Lisa in Ferndale, you know, established and trusted, and we're better off supporting Lisa with her work in the community than trying to do it ourselves. So that's our commitment.
Simone, I'm going to put up the slide that you've produced, which I think is a really good way of showing how you see your role within the wider community as an anchor organisation. So do you want me to give some context to this just quickly? Yeah. Let me just put it up. Okay. If people can just let me know whether it's actually on the screen. Has it appeared? Yeah. There you are. Okay. So the context to this visual then, and it was Lisa's team that designed this for us. We worked really, there we are, there it is. So we worked really closely with Lisa's team, and this was a really hard concept for us. But the context to it is that we were lucky enough to get some, or to successfully gain some of the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund grant back last year, and we had a Foundational Economy officer and some consultants that worked with us for a year to look at inside RHA, our policies and processes, and then in our relationships with our contractors and our partners, and were we really supporting the foundational economy? Did people really know what it meant? And what we found was, and you know, everybody will identify with this, the language around foundational economy is very academic and actually doesn't mean a lot.
to our tenants, to some of our partners and contractors, but to staff as well. And some of the oh, sorry, Dave, I can see you met Annalisa, you said, yeah. What we were talking about and kind of what we learned was for people to really get on board with us, they always ask the question, why are you interested as a housing association? Why are you a member of the Chamber of Trade? Why do you care about your high streets? Why are you invested in local community projects? Because people still, I think, see housing associations as landlords. So we work quite hard to identify the things as an anchor organisation. And again, I know that's a really kind of academic term. The things that we felt we had a responsibility to our communities to deliver and to work on. And the reason we have those responsibilities, which are in the clouds there. So we employ local people, we work together with community partners, we care about our environment, spend our money locally, support local business. And again, obviously we provide affordable and secure homes. But the reason we have a responsibility to do and commit to all of those things was because, you know, all of those things would benefit our tenants who live in communities. So if we can support all of those things to happen and communities to thrive, then ultimately our tenants thrive because they have nicer places to live. It's that simple, but that was really hard to describe. So we created this visual because we're going to form a working group internally from across different areas of the business to just come together regularly and make sure that we are still committing to this way of working and through all our contracts and through all our ways of working, and not only committing to it. We don't want to shout about what we're doing in, you know, look how good we are, but we do want to share best practice and challenge other people to work in the same way. So this is kind of the start of our journey. And it is an internal journey because we're still working on getting all staff to understand this commitment in the way that we do. But yeah, again, another aspect of our partnership with the Arts Factory, we had lots of difficult conversations with Martin, me trying to explain to him what I wanted and how to put this in a visual. But yeah, I think he's done a really good job. So this is being shared now. It's been shared internally and through some of our strategies and stuff. Yeah.
Thanks, Simone. That's excellent. So does anybody want to ask anything? As I said, you've got two contrasting practitioner experiences here. Mike, obviously, you know, like you said, even older, not older than me, but longer experience than me. And he's not older than me, actually. In terms of, you know, done it over decades, you know, lots and lots of sort of experience of putting it into practice. And here we're talking about a very long-standing relationship, but now beginning to edge into housing and look at possibilities in that sphere as well. So quite a good contrast, I think, leading into the discussion groups. Does anybody want to ask a quick question of either Simone or Lisa? Mike, you've got your hand up, have you? You're on mute, Mike.
I'll let other people speak first, but I have got a comment.
Keith, there's a question in the chat from Norma who says, will HAs have a nominated person to liaise with CLH self-build co-ops? So I don't know whether Norma wants to elaborate on that at all.
Hello, everyone. I'm a member of Dovey Housing Co-op. We've had a property which we've just sold, and we're very keen to find a site to do a self-build using timber frame method because we're quite near the Centre for Alternative Technology. And I wondered if there is a nominated person in our local housing association who would know about this new mechanism of mutual support, whom I could talk to. Obviously, we're gathering local architects and other people who've done self-builds around here, as well as finding a site. But I didn't know about this initiative of housing association involvement, so very interesting.
Do you mind, Norman, if I ask you, you said you're Dovey Valley, is that, am I right, or?
Dovey Housing Co-op Limited is, we're in Machynlleth.
Oh, right, okay.
In Powys.
Okay, so again, Dave and Hugh and others might know, and Casey, the housing associations obviously in that area are Baku, the recently merged association. I'm not quite sure who else operates in that area, but what about, does anybody from the team want to say about what sort of links they've got with housing associations on the ground in that part of the world?
Well, sorry, my camera's not on. I've had internet problems today, but Keith is on the call. Who has connection with Barcode. I'm not sure if he's still here. I'm working with Norma now on their project, and we'll be supporting her going forward. But and I've had various conversations with Keith over time about these connections. But Keith, you're on now, so maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, hi there, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm having a few connection issues myself, to be honest. But yeah, I'm a rural housing enabler based at Barcode, and of course RHEs are independent roles, part-funded by Welsh Government. But obviously my email address, for example, is keith.henson@barcode.cymru, so I have a good partnership within the organisation itself. But it is about creating the links, and just echo some of the comments that have already been made from RHA, really, in terms of how social landlords work within the community, and with Barcode now covering Ceredigion and Powys following the merger of Tai Ceredigion and Mid Wales Housing Association. You know, the Mid Wales area is more or less covered in line with the growing Mid Wales growth zone. So you can see how synergies happen, I suppose, in terms of how Welsh Government want to see areas and regions develop as well. It's all about working with the local community, and I think there's more and more of that happening all the time. And interestingly for Barcode as well, I suppose, it comes from, you know, one part in terms of Tai Ceredigion was a stock transfer, and then Mid Wales Housing, yeah, probably goes back to kind of the 80s situation where it was a housing association set up. So yeah, it is about working with the local communities of things and identifying how local communities want to see housing associations work within there as well. You know, there's a new facility being built through European funding in Lampeter, for example, and it's looking about economic regeneration, and there'll be a training agency set up there as well to help not only tenants within the area, but actually the people as well in terms of unemployed individuals as well. So you know, there's lots of activity going on, and you're trying to develop not only housing, but opportunities for tenants within the housing sector as well, I suppose. Does that make sense?
Points very well made, Keith. You know, the whole point is that this all links together. You know, you can't put things into boxes, and I think it's a really good point, well made. I'm going to suggest, if it's okay, that Claire now switches us and allocates us to the discussion groups for about 20 minutes. And we'll have a chance to have a more sort of informal chat and chip in and what have you, and get the conversation going. And then maybe have a quick recap on where we got to before Nick pulls the session to a close. Is that okay with everybody? Okay.
I'll just mention while Claire's setting that up that it is really difficult for community-led housing projects to know sometimes who to contact within housing associations, particularly if there's a few in a different that operate in an area. So I think that's absolutely one of the things that the programme aims to do, either directly through ourselves or through our mentors. And I know Keith has, as he mentioned, also been working with Action for Cairo and Ely, ACE based in Cardiff. And again, that was partly around introductions to housing associations to really kickstart those conversations. So.
Okay, everyone's going to have something coming up on their screen now asking them to join the room. So if you join the room, I think I've allocated facilitators correctly, hopefully. So so enjoy the conversation. It should last for 20 minutes, and then we'll be back for Nick to do a recap on everything that's been discussed today. So there you go.
Oh, there. Elfyd, do you want to finish what you were saying? Because you got cut off just at the end there. Or maybe they're not back yet. Just bear with me.
Thanks. Here we are. So I was just going to say, it's good to recognise places in Townsville. So we're hopefully going to talk to some of the farmers around the village to see if they've got any patches of land that we could work with them. We're hopefully going to use the Community Land Trust scheme to work with them. And we've got 3 areas within Townsville itself, in Compressor, the village of Townsville itself, on Branaper, which we're hopefully going to work with the farmers to get some houses for young people there, some cheap and efficient houses. Fingers crossed, at least.
Cheers, Elfyd. Thank you for that. That's great. I'm just gonna. I don't think it's going to be possible to summarise everything that's been said in the different groups, but I just wanted to pick one thing from my group, and then I was going to ask the other group facilitators to just say something as well. Casey, what would you want to say about one of the things that came out of the group that you think was important?
I think in terms of some of the opportunities that we identified, thinking about heritage buildings and some of the traditional buildings in our, and maybe our high streets as well. So thinking outside the box, not just always thinking about new build, but utilising some of our empty properties. I think that is something that I'm really passionate about, and it is utilising empty properties and not necessarily always having to think about new build. And I suppose one of the barriers I think that came out is just sort of knowing next steps. And I think that's a key role for us at the Wales Cooperative Centre, is to try and make it as easy as possible for people to actually do this, do community-led housing, and for us to sort of be there for that journey and to be able to help people to sort of, advise them on what the next step is. So I think those are the sort of key opportunities and barriers I picked up from ours.
Cheers, Casey. Is it Nick and Claire, I think, are facilitating the other 2 groups? Is that right?
Yeah, I was in facilitating a group. I mean, we had a brilliant conversation, and Michelle from ACE introduced a little bit more about the project that she's working on and the direction she's moving in. I'd just pick up on a quick comment from Di Davis that he made at the end around potentially one of the challenges might be that actually there could be increased competition for land. Now some of the local authorities are looking at starting their own development programs, which could potentially be in competition with housing associations and community-led housing. So I'll just pass over to Claire for the last feedback.
There were quite a few things that came out from our group, really. I was lucky enough to be in the group with Lisa and Simone. So, and we talked there about the existing experience with RHA and how valuable that was, and that those relationships have really helped, more so than making the connections with other housing associations in that county. But we also talked about how we can struggle to connect with some of these organisations. Keith Henson was also in the group, and as a rural housing enabler, he has that link with the community, and he's someone that you can go to. But there can be issues around identifying the decision makers and who can help cultivate that relationship to start working together as well, and just having that named contact within housing associations is really, really valuable. But also picking up on what Casey said about other buildings and so on, there was some discussion about retrofit as well, but also maximising opportunities with some of the groups looking at community-led housing, because they're often looking at other related things as well, like live workspaces, creating employment, tackling climate change. And and where housing now sits with Welsh Government, I think there's massive opportunities within that for us. So so it's just maximising all of those opportunities really. And I've taken us to 1:30, so I should be quiet now.
That was great, Ken. Loads and loads of stuff. I mean, it's always the case. You get to the end of this and you just think, wow, there's at least 10 other things we could be exploring for the next hour or so. Easy peasy. So without any further ado, I think I've got loads of stuff out of this. Brilliant stuff. Nick, do you want to just say a few words to bring it to a close?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, I think we could easily have another networking session on topics around this. I just guess I'd like to say thank you to all the speakers today, and for everybody that has attended as well. Claire, do we know what the next networking session is going to be on?
Well, I believe we've decided to take a break for August, with people hopefully being on holidays and so on, especially with some of the restrictions being eased. And then we're back in September. And what were we going to talk about, Casey? Because we talked about this yesterday and my mind's gone blank. Was it something to do with, it wasn't self-build, was it?
No, so I think we're going to be discussing second homes at the September network. Obviously, it's been a really big issue over the last couple of months. I mean, it's been a big issue for a long time, but I think COVID has really brought it to the forefront. And we just want to have a discussion with you and anybody else who's interested about sort of whether community-led housing can be a solution to tackling some of the problems caused by second homes. So we will surely be sending out details of that very soon. So you're all more than welcome to join.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Casey. Yeah, so thank you again to all our speakers, and I think we'll see you in September. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.